Popper initially remained a somewhat critical socialist, but over time he became convinced that the control of bureaucracy, which would be likely to increase under socialism, posed a problem that socialists simply hadn't resolved. Further, he thought that the Marxist-inspired ideas of the Austrian Social Democrats were not only theoretically incorrect, but that they also led to practical disasters in Austrian politics. All this meant that while Popper was politically radical, ended up critical of socialism, especially as one found it in the Marxist tradition. And while he was sympathetic to egalitarian ideas, he in the end concluded that the aims of egalitarianism couldn't be realized, couldn't actually be brought about without the loss of liberty. Popper was also more generally critical of the advocates of large-scale economic and social planning, the very same people against whom Hayek wrote his Road to Serfdom. Prior to reading The Road to Serfdom, and as I've indicated, being shocked by the degree to which it had anticipated his own ideas, Popper had only met Hayek briefly in London and had delivered a talk on the poverty of historicism to a seminar on the methodology of the social sciences that Hayek and Ginsberg organized at the LSE. He'd read a few of Hayek's writings, but he had no idea the degree to which they were thinking critically along similar lines. Let me indeed now turn to Hayek. His life will probably be better known to you, not least through the work of Bruce Caldwell and Ebenstein. However, some things may not be well known, especially concerning how Hayek came to write The Road to Serfdom. Hayek came from an academic background, and the family had had long-standing concerns with biology. Hayek was old enough to serve briefly in the First World War, and he returned from the war to the University of Vienna, where he studied law and economics. Hayek studied economics with Wieser, but he then worked with Mises as a public servant concerned with private international economic settlements. Hayek was, however, able to spend some time in the United States in the period 1923 to 4, and as Bruce Caldwell's work has brought out, this period seems to have been important for Hayek for a number of different reasons. In Vienna, Hayek had been well aware of the so-called Methodenstreit, the methodological disagreement between the theoretically oriented Austrian economists and the so-called younger historical school, the followers of Schmoller. They favored an atheoretical, inductive approach to the study of economic phenomena. They also typically favored ideas about social reform, which the Austrian economists thought were utopian and thought were problematic. In New York, Hayek came across Wesley Mitchell and the group of institutionalists gathered round Mitchell at Columbia. They were a lively and interesting group, bubbling with new ideas. But to Hayek, they actually seemed to be espousing the very ideas that came out of the younger historical school. Ideas which Hayek believed to be both defective and also dangerous in their practical consequences. Why? Well, because they disregarded the important lessons from theoretical economics about the limitations on our ability to make attractive-looking social reforms. Hayek, however, returned to Vienna, and when he was first there, he worked as director of an institute for research on trade cycles. In this context, he made an application for funding to the Laura Rockefeller Memorial Foundation. It, in fact, at the time, was about the only significant source for research funding that was open to him. But it was also in the hands of people who favored a strictly empirical, an inductivist approach to economic phenomena. Hayek was delighted to receive an invitation to lecture at the LSE in London. He was subsequently offered a chair there, a sort of posh professorship. But the director, that's to say the president of the LSE, was William Beveridge, another enthusiast for empiricism. Beveridge was also managing to get vast sums of money from the Laura Rockefeller Memorial for the LSE, including for its library. But the money that he got also included the funds which brought Lancelot Hogben, an enthusiastic socialist, a planner, an empiricist, and, like Mitchell himself, a behaviorist, to a chair of social biology at the LSE. All this served, in Hayek's view, to unite a number of ideas that he thought not only to be problematic for the social sciences, but also to jeopardize an inherited liberal social order. For in part it was Hayek's view that the ideas which were becoming popular would have disastrous unintended consequences if they were persisted with. And in part, Hayek felt that he'd seen it all before, that the English-speaking world was following intellectually the very path which had been followed in Germany and in Austria. In America, Hayek had read the work of various British liberals, and this, together with the influence of Mises' critique of socialism and Hayek's early readings of liberals round Goethe, led Hayek to sympathy with liberalism of a kind that was popular in England in the 19th century. When he got to England, though, he found that these views were then rather rarer than he'd expected. He found common ground with Lionel Robbins and with Clapham, the economic historian who he got to know at Cambridge. But he found himself at odds with a younger generation of people, such as, when he met him in Cambridge, Joseph Needham, the Marxist biologist and subsequently historian of Chinese science. Such people, and there were a good number of them around at the time, were scientistic, individualistic and anti-traditionalistic, and in addition they favored the kind of economic planning that Hayek argued would lead to disaster. Hayek was taken by Robbins to the Reform Club in London, one of the famous men's clubs there. He subsequently became a lifelong member of the Reform Club. I actually had lunch with him there once. I should say in passing that the food was really pretty awful. It was like boarding school food or refectory food. One striking thing there, though, was that Hayek sat in on the discussion between Henry Wilson Harris, a journalist, and H.G. Wells. Harris met sometimes with a group of people who called themselves the Old Whigs, liberals of the old school with whom Hayek sympathized. But Hayek was struck by how in discussion they actually got the worst of the discussion with more rationalistic and more strongly individualistic liberals. Indeed, in attempting to defend a more traditionalist approach to liberalism, they were sometimes simply silenced by this younger generation of people in argument. And Hayek really resolved to try to do something about this in his own work. If you're interested actually in an image of what these kinds of exchanges must have been like, there is in fact a striking account of something along similar lines in the first part of C.S. Lewis's science fiction trilogy, that's the third volume of it, namely That Hideous Strength. Because in the first part of That Hideous Strength, Lewis discusses issues of academic politics in a small college. And one has in a striking way exactly the kind of tensions and oppositions which struck Hayek, but also, again, in exactly the same way, the defenders of the older perspective were just reduced to silence. All this served, I think, to shape Hayek's concerns beyond the purely economic, the area in which, up to that point, Hayek had made his reputation. And what this then meant was that there was a steady stream of work from Hayek of a character that went well beyond his earlier concerns in theoretical economics and the history of economic thought. For example, he edited the collection, putting into English material about the socialist calculation argument in his volume Collectivist Economic Planning. His Trend of Economic Thinking, which he gave as his inaugural address at the LSE, took issue with the younger German historical school and thus implicitly with their allies in the English-speaking world. While, as Bruce Caldwell has emphasized, in August 1939, Hayek wrote to Fritz Machlup about a big project that he was planning to undertake on, I quote, the abuse and decline of reason.